Our next speaker is, I think, well known to all of us, a long-time professor of Irish history in UCD and the author of a number of books about Sinn Féin and Cosgrave and such items. And he's going to speak to us today about the rise of Sinn Féin. Professor Michael Laffan. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. And I'll try to be very careful. I tend, when I lecture, to wave my hands, but I know it's not a sensible thing to do in these circumstances this afternoon. There are two ways of looking at the Sinn Féin triumph in December 1918. It can be seen, first of all, as the climax of a long-standing policy, outlined by Arthur Griffiths in 1904 in his booklet, The Resurrection of Hungary, and propagated for many years after that, urging Irish MPs to withdraw from Westminster, establish a parliament in Dublin, set up a government responsible to that parliament, and let that government administer the country as if the British didn't exist. Very sensibly, on two occasions when he had the opportunity to try and put that into effect, he didn't. The two elections of January and December 1910, he knew that if he ran candidates with that policy, it wouldn't work. The Irish people would throw it out, so he waited for favourable circumstances, and eventually those favourable circumstances arrived. He did manage to ensure that a majority of Irish MPs adopted his policies, abstained from Westminster, set up a parliament, and elected a government responsible to that parliament. But these circumstances were under conditions that he could never have envisaged. In fact, if he did envisage them, he ruled them out as totally impossible, ridiculous, absurd. So let's look, for the rest of my talk, at those circumstances, those contingent factors. First of all, as a background, the radicalisation of Irish public opinion, first of all through Carson and the Ulster Volunteers, then through the Easter rebels and their revolt against British rule. That rebellion, of course, followed by the executions. Now, there had to be executions. It would have been totally impossible, inconceivable, not to have executed the leaders. Of course, the British had no choice. They made a mess of it. That's another matter. They shot some of the wrong people, but there had to be executions. But even a handful of executions, rather than the 15, 16 that did take place, would have been too much for Irish public opinion, and there was the beginning of a process of change in public opinion, followed, consolidated, if you like, by the Home Rule negotiations in the summer of 1916, which discredited the Home Rule Party. It's quite possible that Dermot Meleady will discuss that when he follows me in the next session. Those discussions, the releases of prisoners at the end of 1916, and a series of by-elections in 1917, 4 in a row won by what became the Sinn Fan Party, all these radicalised Irish nationalist opinion, but also politicised very many of the radicals. There was a synthesis, a coming together of two different traditions, physical force and democracy. And some of those, just to take the most obvious one possibly, Michael Collins, who had little time for democracy and despised his own generation, came to realise that when members of his own generation shared his views, well, maybe they weren't all that stupid after all. Maybe they were worth pandering to and further convincing to follow his views to what he saw as the logical conclusion. So Griffith was faced with, when he was let out of jail in 1916 and before he was rearrested in 1917, he was faced with a wholly new set of circumstances. Long ago, in the 1960s, Terence Devere wrote about Griffith as follows. I think of Arthur Griffith as a man who has toiled for 10 years to write a play, dedicating all his time, sacrificing everything for this play, and when it is written, finding that no one will put it on. And then, after 10 years, the play is the thing. It makes a popular success, but in a guise which bears little resemblance to the play as it had been written. He was eventually to take a leading part in the distorted version of his own play. His performance was thought by some to be the best thing of his life, by others an anticlimax. If a name is to be given to Griffiths' play, it is Sinn Féin. That was how Devere White began his article. The concluding sentence, several pages later, goes, again about Griffith, of course, he believed, I am sure, that his original faith in his play was justified, even though the theatre had gone up in flames and was blazing around him when he died. So the circumstances between 1910, when Griffith didn't contest the election, 1916, when he was arrested, and 1922, when he died, were all transformed. And a central part of that transformation was the radicalisation and the repoliticisation of very many Irish nationalists. They, the rebels who had fought in 1916, now discovered that politics worked. They could achieve results in a format that they hadn't expected. They brought to their new calling a military discipline. They were able to win votes. They were able to rout time after time the Home Rule Party. And events continued to play into their hands. As mentioned this morning, they lost 3 by-elections in a row in early 1918, but these were probably atypical cases. And then momentum was restored by the British government, by the imposition or attempted imposition of conscription, courtesy originally of Lenin and Trotsky, and their surrender to the Germans at Brest-Litovsk, enabling the Germans to move 1 million soldiers from the eastern to the western front, break through the western front, end the deadlock that had lasted for 3.5 years at the cost of millions of lives, and threatened Paris. Under those circumstances, Lloyd George and his colleagues said, well, we don't care about Ireland. Ireland doesn't matter. What matters is winning the war, and if we can win the war through Irish soldiers in the British Army, the UK Army, we will do it. He and his colleagues who shared his views, overruled all the good advice they were given by all the experts, including Edward Carson. They were informed, recruit the Irish, you might as well recruit Germans. But they went ahead and tried to recruit the Irish, and the result, of course, a massive determination to resist by Irish nationalists, led by Sinn Féin and the Irish Volunteers. And John Dillon, I'm sure Dermot will mention this, John Dillon and the Home Rulers joined in, but the initiative was taken by Sinn Féin, and when the British arrested all the Sinn Féin leaders and left the Home Rule leaders in incriminating liberty, everybody in nationalist Ireland, apart from a few loyal Home Rulers, said, Sinn Féin is doing the business. And even though Lloyd George very soon came to realise that conscription is not on, there's no point in going ahead with it, that couldn't be revealed in public. That would have resulted in a loss of face. So right to the end of the war, the British said, we will introduce conscription, but not quite yet. But we will. So Sinn Féin was able to say, we've saved you in May and June, we will now save you in September, October, November, and keep the pressure up and keep the gratitude towards Sinn Féin in existence until the very end of the year. Now, long before December, it was taken for granted there would be an election. After the franchise was extended in February, a wartime election was due, and when Germany surrendered vastly more quickly than anybody had expected, particularly the Germans, the election turned out to be not a wartime but a peacetime election. But long before the armistice, Sinn Féin was getting ready, choosing candidates, sometimes in very controversial circumstances. There was nomination by a small group of people. Michael Collins and Dermot O'Hegarty were particularly renowned for putting their men in. And one result of that was that 46%, very nearly half, of the elected Sinn Féin candidates didn't live in their own constituencies, a pattern that would be inconceivable now or for almost all the history of independent Ireland, but was a sign of how things were managed and controlled from the top. Throughout the year, Sinn Féin was harassed by the British authorities. 4 directors of elections in a row were arrested. 34 of its elected candidates were in jail, and almost all the others elected had been in jail at one stage or another in recent years. The party acquired a martyr's image. And long before the campaign began, it was widely taken for granted that Sinn Féin would win. The importance, of course, of the British first-past-the-post system has been mentioned this morning. There's no need for me to go back over that again. And even without its leaders, Sinn Féin ran an effective campaign. Organisers were sent to every constituency. Candidates were chosen long before the end of the war. Things were managed from the top. There was a determined effort at registration of new voters, particularly, of course, of women. The extreme case, the most extreme that I've come across in County Derry, was of a woman aged 105 and a 7-year-old girl going to the polling stations. Both had been registered, the girl, of course, by mistake. In the tiny Sligo village of Suey, Sinn Féiners tried to get the vote for 91 of their supporters and succeeded in 82 cases. A pretty good record. Constituencies had been warned. You're on your own. It's not like a by-election when we can bring in helpers from all around the country. This time each constituency will have to fight by itself. But it wasn't like that. After all, again, we've heard this morning, 25 seats were uncontested. That meant there were a lot of spare Sinn Féiners who could be sent to particularly important constituencies where the result might be close or significant or symbolic. So in East Mayo, John Dillon's constituency, Sinn Féiners from elsewhere in the county and from remote parts of Ireland like Clare arrived to urge East Mayo voters to choose Devere. The party stressed its role as the heir of the Easter rebels, and many candidates demanded a republic. Not all. In 1922, when Collins was chairman of the provisional government and was somewhat embarrassed by claims that he had abandoned or sold the republic, he carried out, or had a search carried out for him, as to what he had actually said in 1918. And to his doubtless great relief, it was found that he had mentioned sovereignty, the independent nation, the national right to rule ourselves, and so on, but never the dread word republic. In any event, by 1918, republic was no longer a bogey as it had been a few years earlier, associated with anti-clericalism, persecution of the Catholic Church in France, Switzerland, Portugal, and so on. There were lots of new republics. Russia, Germany, Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Baltics, and so on. And republics were seen as relatively normal by now. Sinn Féin said, and this was being quoted this morning, John Bruton mentioned it, that Sinn Féin would use any and every means to achieve independence. An implication that violence might be one of those means. But it also portrayed itself as the peace party that had saved Ireland from conscription, saved so many young Irishmen from being sent to be killed in France. Sinn Féin was able to overcome another threat, Labour, which had been, of course, split between North and South, and Labour stood aside, thereby avoiding the risk, from Sinn Féin's point of view, of splitting the non- or the anti-Home Rule vote. This is often seen as a reason why Labour never made a breakthrough in later years or decades. I don't accept that argument at all. Labour did remarkably well just 13 months later in local elections in January 1920, and I believe it was the Civil War, not 1918, that pushed Labour into the role of the half party in a 2.5 party system that had it occupied for so many decades. We've heard this morning about violence and intimidation, and of course there was violence and intimidation. Yeah, of course. There was in every election. Sinn Féin didn't introduce that into Irish public life, not at all. It had been a time dishonoured feature of by-elections and general elections when they had been contested. But of course, there had been a long tradition in Irish public life of uncontested elections, which is why, part of the reason why the Home Rule Party was unprepared or unable to put up as good a fight as might have been expected. The results, as we know, 73 for Sinn Féin, 6 for the Home Rulers, and 26 for the Unionists. And because of those 25 uncontested seats, almost all of which would have gone to Sinn Féin, the Sinn Féin vote was seriously underrepresented in consequence. So The result, the uncontested election of 25 Sinn Féin MPs, the victory of Sinn Féin virtually everywhere in the 3 southern provinces, except Waterford and Rathmines and Trinity College. They were the only areas that Sinn Féin failed to win. County Louth, a very, very close run thing. But it wasn't a surprise. In West Cork, for example, one of the uncontested constituencies, the RIC county inspector remarked before the poll, no one but a Sinn Féin candidate could have stood a chance of being elected. And less than a month after this election, those Sinn Féin MPs who are not in jail, most of them were, or not engaged in other business, Michael Collins was in England rescuing Devere from Lincoln jail, they met and proclaimed themselves the independent Parliament of Ireland, re-proclaiming democratically the republic that Pearse had proclaimed outside the GPO on Easter Monday in 1916. And this represented the reconstitution of the Irish democratic tradition that had been battered, as I said a few minutes ago, by Carson and the Volunteers, the Ulster Volunteers, and by the Easter rebels. It was reformed in part under the leadership of those who had undermined it in earlier years, when the constitutional democratic tradition was represented by the Home Rule Party. Violence had worked. The British were soon prepared to give way vastly more as the result of dead bodies in ditches and in lanes than would have been the case otherwise, as violence has so often worked. The British gave way to force, as they have so often given way to force. Joe Devlin, for example, during the election campaign, lamented that as long as we spoke in the House of Commons in a constitutional way, we did not count. It takes a rebellion and things of that sort to bring home the grim realities of the situation. But in 1918, Irish politics, the Irish people, Irish nationalism were repoliticised. And the election resulted in a largely civilian government, recognised, at least in theory, at least in principle, by most of the soldiers. Most volunteer units in 1919 took an oath of allegiance to the Dáil. And when the treaty negotiations took place in 1921, it was a civilian delegation that went to London and passed on the treaty for acceptance or rejection by a largely civilian parliament with many soldiers in it, but acting as a civilian body. So that election of December 1918 was of crucial importance in reviving, consolidating the democratic tradition, a tradition which has, despite the horrors of the Civil War and the brutality with which it was waged and in which the government defeated the rebels, resulted in the victory of a government committed to the wishes of the people, respect for the wishes of the people, the establishment of a democratic tradition which we have held ever since. That is why we now, in the last week or two, have seen and heard so much about the 1918 election, and rightly so. As mentioned earlier, that we have heard and read over decades a great deal about violence and the Easter Rising. Now a balance is being struck, and I think it is essential that the role of that election 100 years ago, yesterday, should be acknowledged.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for that. We have a few on the minutes for questions or comments. Again, as I said this morning, please keep them brief so that we can have as many participants as possible. Yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask two questions. Three questions. Had the election been 12 months earlier, roughly what the results may have been, and if it wasn't for continuous violence after 1918, it's unlikely that the British would have left Ireland, really.
If it had been held, the election had been held 12 months earlier, I think Sinn Féin would still have won. After all, it had won 4 by-elections in a row by the end of 1917. It had overcome its internal difficulties. Griffiths had been replaced by Devere. The idea of a dual monarchy was replaced by a republic. So everything was in shape. There was the setback in early 1918. The result would have been the same. I have no doubt that the Home Rulers would have won more seats, but Sinn Féin would still have won. Violence and did the British give way in 21 because of force? Yes, they did. Violence works, and not just the Irish or the British context. Violence works. As late as the summer of 1920, Lloyd George was determined to give nothing more away than the Government of Ireland Act. 2 Home Rule Parliaments, one in the north, one in the south. Then suddenly, he began changing his mind. But even as late as the spring of 1921, he said, we are not going to tolerate anything that goes significantly beyond the Government of Ireland Act. And then there was a collapse of morale, partly because of a revulsion in Britain against the methods used in Ireland. So violence worked, but the point that I wanted to stress is that violence was accompanied by political and administrative achievements. So it wasn't just a war of independence, it was a struggle that was political, administrative and military.
I wonder, Michael, just picking up the obverse side of that question, Elaine Callinan this morning implied that if the election had been later than it was, that with the troops coming back and that in fact the Irish Parliamentary Party might have put in a stronger performance at a later date.
The reason for a delay of 2 weeks between the election and the announcement of the result was to get the soldiers' votes.
Okay.
Now, there were some of them in Mesopotamia, and that was too far. But those in France were able to vote, not all of them, that they voted in fewer numbers than had been expected, but a lot of them did vote, a lot didn't. It might have made a difference, say, in County Louth, where Sinn Féin won by a fraction of 1%. But for the most part, I don't think it would have done. So,
okay.
No.
Well, I just wanted to pick up the point that Elaine made. Yes, Tom.
I think very interesting point about civil litigation.
If it's to me, I'm old and deaf, so shout.
Michael made an interesting point that civil delegation went to London for the treaty.
Yes.
But in 1922, the heartland of the struggle in Munster, which was the heartland of the uncontested seats in 1918, and the heart of the Civil War struggle, that area and the volunteers massively rejected the treaty, and the GHQ leadership of the volunteers accepted the treaty, Collins and the rest of them. But with one exception, the Dublin squad, Collins' professional assassins, no unit of the volunteers became part of the Free State Army. So in fact, there was no loyalty in practice to civil authority or the will of the people on the part of the vast bulk of the most active volunteers in the period.
Certainly the most active volunteers in Cork, by and large, voted, or acted and fought against the treaty. But volunteers throughout the country did. Certainly there was a majority in the army against the treaty. So you have a very, very clear case of the army against the people. The people voted 78% in favour of pro-treaty candidates, 22% against pro-treaty candidates. So to put it at its bluntest and to exaggerate, it was a struggle between the army and the people. Now, that is far too neat, far too sharp a distinction. Of course, there were soldiers, Collins and others, who sided with the majority of the people, and there were civilians, naturally, who supported the Republicans. But there was a very, very strong wish for peace. It was felt that only the treaty could provide peace, and for that reason, and possibly also for the reason that very many people felt this is much better than we ever thought we were going to get 2 or 3 years ago. It's not a bad deal at all. And is the Republic all that terribly important? There was that basic conflict with some reservations between the army and the people. And ultimately, a government responsible to the people using blunt, brutal, harsh military measures won.
Yes.
There's an interesting parallel, I think, in Germany, or not a parallel, a contrast. To some extent, German independence was the long fruit of economic union, the customs union, and then Friedrich List's plan for a federal independence, which is what we got now.
That's not really a question, more a comment. So yes.
No, exactly. That was a comment.
Yeah. I just say one thing. So Arthur Griffith, as you no doubt know, used to cite Friedrich List a lot Frederick List is known to economists as the father of the infant industry argument, so it relates to what I said. But he ignored so much of what List said. So List said protectionism can be very good for big countries like Germany, but for small countries, and he specifically mentioned Ireland, he says, in a case of a small country, it doesn't make sense and will rapidly turn to private monopoly. And that's kind of what we saw over the course of the 30s, 40s and 50s.
Yes.
Was it Arthur Griffiths' theory that there was quite an amount of money available in Ireland for investment, but the banks would not invest in Ireland, they would only invest in Britain and elsewhere?
Yeah, that's certainly true. So another component, in case you didn't hear the question, so another component of Griffith's thought was certainly, that the banks were not investing in Ireland, but were investing in Britain. And that actually was the case, and it proved to be the case for decades after independence as well. And, the way an economist looks at it is, that's the way the private market works. You might criticize it, but if you have a country that tells the banks where to invest, well, countries like that usually are not the kind of countries that generate economic growth. So there is a tension there, but you're right, that's part of Griffith's theory.
Okay, if we don't have any further questions, we'll take a little comfort break now and come back we'll start again in about 500 minutes just to get set up with our last panel. So I will thank our two speakers again. Thank you.